Hi, everybody. Today is Monday, February 17th, 2025, and our friend John Helmer is back with us. Welcome back, John.
Thank you for having me, Nima.
Let's get started with Donald Trump and what's going on right now in Saudi Arabia. How do you see the way that Donald Trump is trying to negotiate with Russia without considering the European countries together with Ukraine being part of this initial sort of talks on their part?
Well, so far as we know, and there are contradictions and conflicts between various members of the Trump team, so called, and there are two layers of Trump team. So let's come back to them in a minute. Uh, the Saudi Arabian meetings are preparatory for what may be an attempt by um, Mr. Trump to grandstand in a meeting with President Putin without the extent of the preparations for an end of war agreement being in place. In other words, Trump will go for a grandstanding summit meeting, which would then give directions for the parameters of an end of war. That appears to be what's in preparation in Saudi Arabia. Second, we can get a little better understanding of what might happen and what can't happen by looking at the membership of the two negotiating teams, Russia and the United States on the one hand, and the Ukrainian delegation in another room on the other hand. We don't know the Ukrainian membership. We know that President Zelensky's disclaimed their authority and will show up himself in Saudi Arabia the next day, on Wednesday. So, what we have is, on the one hand, the Americans, Secretary of State Rubio, National Security Advisor Waltz, and the money to money negotiator, the oligarchs to oligarchs negotiator, President Trump's personal representative, Stephen Witkoff. Um, there's some suggestion on the Russian side that in addition to Foreign Minister Lavrov and Presidential Assistant Yuri Ushakov, there will be either Kirill Dmitriev, who's the Russian oligarch negotiator matching Vitkov, Kirill Dmitriev, Russian Direct Investment Fund, the money man, or Sergei Narishkin, the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service, SVR. Since John Ratcliffe, the CIA director, isn't reportedly there, it's unlikely that Narishkin would be there. The three on each side match. What can they talk about? Various, we can go into the details, but at this point, it looks like they're preparing parameters for negotiating end of war terms. On the one hand, the mutual security non-aggression framework that Sergei Lavrov presented, the Russian side presented the United States and NATO in December 2021, which was rejected by the previous administration and has not been addressed by the Trump administration. That's the general framework. The second issue would be the military arrangements, and you've seen over the last few hours the New York Times surface a detailed so-called Cambridge University plan, which is a non-starter in many respects. We can get into that also. It's essentially a freeze of conflict and the preservation of as much Ukraine's as can be obtained at this point without guaranteeing that Russia will retain Crimea, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Lugansk, and Donetsk, full parts of Russia. So we're nowhere near at this stage military disengagement. The so-called Cambridge Plan provides a very limited military engagement, first 1 kilometer, second 7.5 kilometers, withdrawal of heavy weapons, 35 kilometers. This is a nonsense framework which couldn't be accepted by the general staff on the Russian side. And let's remember, Russia is not a one-man state. It's a combination of groups which have been waging war the military, the general staff on the one side, the foreign ministry on the other, and the various factions with business interests and political interests on the other around President Putin. And they are far from clear yet what they will have to decide.
In your opinion, the difficulty that Donald Trump is facing, before getting into the details of what may they talk about, and do you think that Donald Trump, the way that he's handling the situation with European Union, is that it's smart on his part? Because as you know, Keith Kellogg at the Munich Security Conference said that Ukrainian can be part of these negotiations and are part of these negotiations, but the European Union cannot be, because that's not logical, as he mentioned in his sort of answer to at the Munich Security Conference. What would that be in your opinion? What is the main reason that they don't see it's going to be logical to to consider European countries being part of these negotiations at this stage?
I hope I won't disappoint you or our audience if I say a few things about what President Trump and his side look to me to be at this point. In the first place, President Trump is very close to psychotic in his mental capacities. You can see that in the manner of his presentation, the colored hair, the heavy made up face and skin, the inability to listen to questions and answer extensively without repeating one slogan after another. Under pressure, this man's megalomania is going to get worse. He's borderline in some places now. The episode in the Oval Office last week when Elon Musk brought his 4-year-old son into the room demonstrated not only a level of disrespect for the office of the United States presidency, which would offend every American, including me. It shows no capacity to respect the Constitution of the United States and the way the United States is as a country for all Americans, including me. Second, the child was the little boy who pointed out the emperor has no clothes. The text of what the little boy said is disputed by those who've listened and those who've reported. But nonetheless, watch what President Trump does when the child speaks to him. He's frozen. He cannot speak to a child speaking ad lib to him. Why? Compare Prime Minister Modi, who was subjected earlier the same day with the Musk entourage, women, children, and that same little boy. The little boy drew Modi, who doesn't have a child, Trump does, drew Modi's attention, and Modi leaned down, looked at him, smiled at him, talked to him. That's a human, normal, psychologically stable way of dealing with a surprise by a politician who knows the camera's running. Trump cannot respond to surprises. He hasn't, the mental capacity is driven by psychosis, not dementia, not yet, but under the pressure of the presidency, under the pressure of multiple constituencies, people demanding this and that, under pressure of his own internal drives, the man is going to deteriorate. And under deterioration, you'll see what we've seen before. Under pressure, Trump begins to contradict himself, to make statements that are wildly inaccurate, and so on. So at this point, one has to understand Trump is borderline megalomaniacally mad. Second, you've got two layers of people around him. You can have what might be called the Confederate level. That's these individuals, Rubio, Waltz, Hegseth, and others, who have a history of white racism and commitment to fighting the yellow peril, fighting China first. China first. They also believe in a white alliance against the yellow people. I'm saying this rather simply so that the audience who disagrees with me can articulate the evidence, but the evidence for their view. My view is the Confederate level has evolved a strategy which is understood very well. Prime Minister Modi and his Indian advisors understood it very well last week and exploited it for Indian national interest purposes. This Confederate level is white racist and aims to make the war against China effective with Russian participation in one way or another, play the Russians against the Chinese, and therefore devise a Ukrainian end-of-war settlement, which would satisfy enough of the Russian concern that the US can concentrate on fighting China. This is a combination of ideas which we can get into, but it involves racism, it involves continuing the US empire and reducing the amount of friction and cost the US empire undertakes in Europe. Then behind or under the Confederate level, you have the money men. And money drives Trump, money drives Trump's family. The money men at the table in Saudi Arabia are Stephen Witkoff, and behind him or with him are people like Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, Jared Kushner, a member of the family, and obviously Donald Trump Jr. There are more, but let's just say that this is the family in the business, money, you might even say mafia sense of the family. The three groups, or the two groups, the Confederate group and the family group, press on Trump to come up with a formula. For the time being, the only formulas that Trump can easily accept and implement are grandstanding, braggadocio, bombast, threats, and the notion that he's in charge of a deal in which he can either pressure President Putin to make concessions and reward his business supporters to further encourage Putin, or not. This is a highly unrealistic, internally contradictory, violent, a combination. It's inflammable, and it's yet to face across the table serious people, including military people, who know how to fight. On the other hand, this is thrown out, as you said, Nima, and we all see it, a range of European concerns, anxieties, anger, all of which reflect the political base, the weakening political base of each of those European countries. So we have an election coming up in days' time in Germany, which will annihilate the present chancellor and annihilate the Greens. We don't know to what extent the Alliance for Germany, the AfD, the so-called extreme right-wing group, will be able to beat, let's say, 20-25% threshold against the Christian Democratic winner of the election with something like 30% plus. What combination of power in Germany, of administration in Germany, that election will produce? In France, you have a presidency, Macron and his so-called wife, who run a country by decree and whose political support shrinks by the day. And you've got in England, Sir Keir Starmer, who has lost almost all of the political support he had during the election, and is promising on the one hand British boots on the ground, and then not promising it if it's not necessary. You have weakening political consensus in each country. And what's the underlying consensus? The consensus is people can't afford to pay the so-called defense and security price, which the Trump administration is demanding. And then you have the simple, obvious question that all Europeans, all people subject to the pressures on the war front ask, and Vice President Vance put it, against whom Are you preparing your defense? Who are you fighting against? So we have a blizzard of self-interested groups, especially the media, who've been paid not simply by USAID to run the line that the enemies of the world against which the civilized world has to organize are Russia and China. Well, that consensus is breaking up. The money supply to keep propagandizing that is running out. So you have desperate measures on all sides. You have desperate men or women on all sides, especially in the White House, on the US side, and in the European chancelleries. What combination of a rational agreement to secure mutual security and non aggression in Europe can desperate people negotiate? Well, they can't. So, what do we have on the Russian side? Because I'm the Russian correspondent, and you have me here to try to reflect Russian views. Well, I've tried to spell out that there are contradictions, desperate measures, readiness to compromise, and opposition to compromise around President Putin. And we've yet to see the extent to which some of the fundamental objectives of the special military operation will be secured as the outcome. Let's be clear. The special military operation has never been a full-scale war. What we've been seeing in the last 3, 4, 5 weeks is that the casualty rate announced each day by the Defense Ministry has been cut in half. That means operations along the line of contact have been reduced and restricted. Second, the bulletin of the Defense Ministry is beginning to describe vehicles, cars, pickup trucks as indicators of damage to material or destruction of materiel. So you've got half the casualty rate. You've got cars, pickups, trucks listed. You've got obviously evidence of a restriction and a reduction of operations along the contact line. There's nothing, no triumph there. You have no significant electric war campaign damage that's sustainable in the West. So the electric war campaign, which was designed to reduce the Ukraine's capacity to run any machine into the war zone, from Rzeszów, the Polish, center for resupply of Ukraine, the line between Rzeszów, Lvov, and Kiev has never been broken. There's a complete restriction on the Russian general staff to fight a decisive war. There's been no decapitation of the Ukrainian leadership, and so on and so on and so on. What we've got is a story of war making on the Russian side, which has never been correctly predicted by the US bloggers who've considered it a triumph of war making. It's been considerably less, and it's been considerably less for political reasons. So we have on the Russian side a very significant debate. At what cost? The casualty rate is high, and we won't get into the numbers. At what loss of territory against the ambition to secure the 4 regions can the end of war terms be if Russia does not have all of the 4 regions? A demilitarized zone between the westernmost border of the 4 regions and the rest of the Ukraine, a demilitarized zone deep enough that the long-range drone and artillery and rocket and missile attacks on the Russian mainland and on the Donbass will stop. At what cost will the demilitarization of Ukraine be achieved? And then there's the second major objective, which we all understand on the Russian side, is denazification. And have a good look, if the audience will have a good look at the Cambridge plan that the New York Times is promoting, or anything that either the Confederate level of the Trump leadership or the money level of the Trump leadership or of Trump himself have addressed. Denazification means the replacement of the Zelensky regime. Denazification means the elimination of a rump Ukraine based in Lvov, which would act as a Slav-hating, race-hating military camp, which will run permanent war against Russia, much as the groups in Idlib ran permanent war against Syria until the downfall of Bashar al-Assad. Is Russia prepared to have fought this war at the price it's paid to have Idlib, the conditions of Idlib installed between Kiev and Lvov, with the possibility of a breakout at any time, much as we've seen since the end of November in Syria? The answer is it would be irrational and impolitic, and not to say unpopular, impossible for a Russian leadership to accept Idlib in Lvov.
You've raised many important points, but I wanna get back to the point of Europeans. You've mentioned the way that Donald Trump behaves, and we know that Donald Trump isn't a regular, a standard character for being a politician in the United States. But after all, many people who are in favor of Donald Trump are arguing that if we had someone like Kamala Harris or Joe Biden 2.0, the situation could have been much worse than what we're witnessing right now with Donald Trump. Because at least after 3 years of the conflict in Ukraine, we are having direct talks between the two presidents, which wasn't possible before Donald Trump gets to office in Washington. Here comes the question. Europeans, do you understand why Europeans, what do they want from the conflict in Ukraine? Right now, it seems they're totally against Trump's agenda, Trump's sort of strategy in Ukraine. But we don't see anything coming out of Europe. What do they want from Ukraine? How long do they want to continue this conflict?
Well, let me let me speak as an American citizen with a home and family who are Americans in the United States. Let me say that domestic conditions in the United States are degenerating and deteriorating very fast, and they were pretty bad before this election. And the Democratic Party and its candidates and its Democratic National Committee, and after all, I was with the Democratic administration a long time ago, the Carter administration, arguably the last one that had some real connection with Black population, poor population, and so forth and so on of the United States. The United States domestically is in deep, deep crisis. And it won't take very long for those Black voters, Hispanic voters, rural voters, disadvantaged voters, pardon me, to realize that Trump's domestic policy is racist and discriminatory and will assist in the creation of an oligarch ripoff of the country. I mean, I'm not saying anything that lots and lots of Americans, Ralph Nader is the last good American, honest American, whose attack on what Trump's doing to the domestic economy that I've read. But everybody's read their own, and everybody has different opinions. In domestic terms, it won't be long before the Trump campaign will demonstrate its total hypocrisy and falsity. It's one issue. Your question, what do the Europeans want? Well, European people don't want to be cold. They don't want to face the kind of gas bills, energy bills, loss of medical care, I mean, we can go on with the normal agenda. We're human beings, you and me. We understand that when our uh, medical insurance can't pay for our health, when the ambulance doesn't show up, when the hospital in France near where we live, if we're French, or has been closed by Macron's budget, and so forth and so on. When we understand that we have lost the capacity to have a future, housing, education, health, and so on, then what we don't want is 5% GDP spent on defense against an enemy we consider to be less threatening to us than Starmer in London or Macron at the Elysee or whoever will fill the chancellery in Berlin in a few days' time. People want a recovery of hope and medical care and education for children and so forth. I'm sounding like a politician, but I'm just reflecting what's obvious and commonsensical. What we have are desperate leaders who've managed to pull the wool over the electorate's eyes, get themselves elected in landslides like Starmer's landslide in the UK. The UK is desperately short of everything the domestic constituency that voted for Starmer wants and needs. And I've just published a book explaining the only achievement of the British deep state and of the leadership of the Tories and now the leadership of Starmer and the Labour Party. The only achievement is deception operation, propaganda. The book's called Long Live Novichok, the British poison which fooled the world. A poison, deception, misinformation, propaganda that fooled all of the British voters, all of the media. Now, the media get paid to be fooled. People get robbed to be fooled. There's a difference. So, what we've got in Europe are those who have been fooled, but who are having to pay the bill, rebelling in little ways, big ways, and so forth. We've got desperate leadership that has been paid to fool the people, coming up with measures trying to make it look as if they are opposing the Americans, while having absolutely no interest in having US withdrawals from the troop and missile and aircraft and bases, military bases in either Germany or in England or in Greece or in Spain or in Portugal. This is a desperate leadership group which has fooled the world, especially their electors, and are now desperately trying to find an accommodation with the United States so they continue to get paid and continue to sit in power. I hope that answers your question. You've got splits in Europe, you've got splits in the United States, and you've got a war situation on the Ukrainian battlefield, which the NATO allies want to extend to the Arctic, to the south in the Caucasus, and to the Pacific region. And we have a commitment on the part of Trump, the Confederate level, and the money level to wage war against China for imperial purposes, for fooling the world about the threat that China presents. Well, it's a confusing picture because it's a terribly conflicting picture. And some of the people in charge are mad, and some of them are criminal, crooked.
You've mentioned the split in Europe and in the United States, but these divisions that you're talking about in the United States is not that much significant because the current administration wants to find, at least they're talking about, to find a solution for the conflict in Ukraine. But how can we get that sort of decision on the part of Europeans? Who's Europeans? Who are these people? Are we gonna, is Germany, France, United Kingdom, is it Hungary, Slovakia? You have a bunch of countries who who have their own national interests,
Yes.
that they're not getting along with each other, and they want to be part of these negotiations. How is it's impossible for the Trump administration to let them, or for Russia doesn't know. Lavrov today said that he doesn't know what Europe would represent at the negotiating table.
Well,
What do they have to present, in your opinion?
well, pardon me. Uh, you make good points, Nima, and I don't disagree with them. Uh, Prime Minister Modi of India was in Washington last week to agree with President Trump that the national interest is supreme for India, just as Trump announced the national interest is supreme for the United States. And all of us, Europeans, French, British, German, and Polish, and Hungarian, and Bulgarian, and so on, all of us have to say that our national interest should be supreme in these talks. But as you point out, the national interests differ internally, and not only internally, but between the European states as well. And so, what Russia has to do is enter the negotiations with the intent to preserve its supreme national interests. And we've talked about what those national interests are on the contact line, through the demilitarized zone heading west to the denazification of Kiev and Lvov, so that we then reach the Polish border. And at the Polish border, we have a presidential election coming up, if I'm not mistaken, in a country that's deeply split between Eastern voters and Western voters, between urban voters and rural voters, who also, if given a chance, will differ on how much money of the state budget, how much money they contribute from tax, should be spent on recovering their welfare and their family values and so forth and so on, versus spending money on buying multi-billion-dollar US arms systems against the hated Russians on the one side, or against the hated Germans on the other side. Poland has got lots of problems of agreeing on what its supreme national interest should be. So I think the simple answer to your question, Nima, and there are no simple answers, so we're trying to summarize, and we're trying to mobilize people's minds around complicated issues. The simple answer is Russia has to come up with a military formula that generates peace for a generation, not for 5 years, not for the rearmament of the Ukraine. Russia has to come up with that and stick to it. At the same time, Russia is subject to massive economic warfare through the sanctions system, as is Iran, as is North Korea, as is China. Economic warfare cannot be escalated as a result of a de-escalation on a battlefield in Europe. Now, European prosperity has been seriously, critically damaged by the US economic warfare and the sanctions warfare on which NATO and the European Union have agreed. So if sanctions come off, the price of gas in Europe will go down because it will be Russian gas. The warmth in the house, the electricity bill, the ability to pay a mortgage, the ability to pay the tax to send your kids to school, etc., etc. All of that will be a benefit and a boon to European voters. Will the European leaderships come to that level? Well, it's up to Russia to dictate. If you're the winner on the battlefield, and the US bloggers have been saying from the beginning, Russia is winning. Russia's winning in Kursk, but they're not. They haven't removed the Ukrainians from Kursk, though that operation was predicted to have lasted 6 weeks. Well, it's not happened. Russia's got to preserve its objectives, and dictate them at the table and see if they can make the case that an end of war in the Ukraine will be prosperous for the rest of Europe if the sanctions come off at the same time. And that's a proposition which Starmer will try to suppress by the propaganda deception methods I've spoken of. Macron will try to suppress. Whoever becomes the Chancellor of Germany will try to suppress. But the truth will become more obvious.
Do you think that Zelensky wants something like what's going on in between the United States and Israel? It's some sort of security guarantee from on the part of the West for Ukraine. Is that achievable, in your opinion, for Ukraine?
Well, 2 points. One is Zelensky is yesterday's man. He cannot survive the Ukrainian elections, which must take place as part of any settlement to end this war. He's yesterday's man. He's bound for his holiday homes in the Med and the Caribbean and exile in the United States, presumably. Second, what the Trump administration, that's Trump, that's the Confederates, and then the money men, what they aim is not a stable peace in the Middle East. What they aim is what Israel's doing, which is expansionist. It's to produce, to move closer and closer towards Damascus and control the outcome of Damascus, compete against the Turkish control of the Sharia regime to date, and ally itself with the US control of Western Syria running up to the Iraqi border. Israel is an expansionist state and a platform for attacking and destroying the Arabs and destroying Iran. So there's no sign, none that I can see, perhaps somebody listening and watching can see a sign, that the Trump administration has any commitment to relieving the Arab and Iranian sides of the threat of Israeli expansion, militarily, economically, diplomatically, territorially. The same process of imperial expansion is being run and prepared and planned by the Trump administration, the levels of leadership that I've explained, and also explained where it's coming from in the new Pentagon, from a man called Elbridge Colby, William Colby's grandson, the former CIA, Russia-hating, China-hating CIA director, William Colby. Read more on the website if my reference isn't clear. So Trump's strategy is imperial expansion and war fighting. It wants to reduce the cost and the friction in Europe so it can get on with its Middle East plans, its anti-China plans. It's got 2 other wars to wage. Is that an answer to your question? Perhaps in my excitement, I've lost track of the question, but I do not regard the Trump position in Europe as anything but relief in order to concentrate on the 2 other wars. And attached to the Middle Eastern war, we've got the war for Africa. So I have no optimism that in such a strategic plan, Russia can accommodate anything but a temporary interest. And I do not believe Russian public opinion, the major constituencies around the Kremlin, will accept a temporary suspension of hostilities while allowing the US empire to get on with its other 2 big wars.
Keith Kellogg at the Munich Security Conference on one part said that the situation in Ukraine going to be negotiated by the United States. On the other part, he mentioned about the relationship between the partnership between Russia and Iran, Russia and North Korea, and even with China is so much important for the United States. They want to weaken this sort of partnership between Russia and these three countries. Do you think that would come to the how is it going to be if the Trump administration tries to convince Russians at the negotiating table that their future going to be with the United States and the West, not with these three countries, not with BRICS and all of that? Is that convincing for Russia?
Well, 2 points. First of all, General Kellogg is a moron. He has, as a military man, he's never been anything but a loser on the battlefield, starting in Vietnam. You watch carefully his performance in Munich. You can see that he can capably repeat, like his presidential boss, slogans or carefully scripted excerpts of history that he's memorized. The man is not a negotiator, can't be. John Cole is the Trump lawyer who's his deputy, is a capable negotiator, but Kellogg is not. Kellogg is a man who represents slogans written by other people, and that's been his position since he and some others produced a paper for the Trump campaign on how to end the Ukraine war. Kellogg is also not on the Trump designated negotiating team. And the reason is he's too stupid. And it's time that people notice the obvious about Kellogg. He's a front man for slogans. What he says is sloganeering. What you raise as questions are very difficult to answer. And so I go back to something I've just put on my website, an account of how the Indian side sees the expansion of Trump with Russian neutrality in a war against China. Do I understand your question, Nima, to mean, can Russia be persuaded out of its alignment with its strategic friends, Iran, North Korea, and China, in order to let the Trump damage machine fight its wars against each of them? Can Putin and his circle be bought off the Vitkov-Dmitriev negotiating terms? Partial relief of sanctions for Russia, but not for Iran. Partial relief of sanctions for Russia, but not for China. Can this? Well, before we ask and answer that question, don't we come back to the notion that the Trump administration thinks it can persuade Putin to do exactly that? The Trump administration believes it can split Russia from China, Russia from Iran, Russia from North Korea. And the reason they're so convinced is the reason that Prime Minister Modi was as convinced when he was in Washington last week. And look very carefully at what he said. The reason, it's Syria. The reason is the perception and the evidence that President Putin ordered no support for a Russian-Iranian Syrian fight back against the breakout from Idlib that ended in the evacuation of President Assad and the fall of his government and the creation of the present Syrian situation. We've talked about that, Nima. We've had a whole broadcast on the subject. And I understand other people on your program take a very different view. They think that Russia needed to do and sensibly withdrew from Syria in order to concentrate on the Ukraine. Well, you're asking, will the same group of people who think Russia withdrew sensibly from Syria now sensibly withdraw from the Ukraine, leaving the Trump administration freer to attack as it's planning to attack China with its allies, Syria and the rest of the Arab world and Iran through Israel? I'm asking your question. The obvious part answer is there are Trump administration officials who think so, and there are US bloggers whose names are very familiar. Some of them appear on your program, who claim to be supporting Russia and who support this kind of division of labor in the imperial world, division of oligarch spheres of interest in the commercial world, and so on. They believe it. I don't. Maybe we don't have time to argue the details, but I think we will see over the coming weeks whether the military terms of end of war and the end of and the terms of reduction of sanctions represent a Russian retreat or a Russian stand fast. And then it won't be up to us to discuss. Our friends in Beijing are already looking very carefully, as Prime Minister Modi and our Indian friends looked last week, at whether Russia is a reliable strategic ally in the war to come.
John, when you look at Donald Trump, do you see a man, the way that he's trying to deal with the two conflicts in Ukraine and in the Middle East, do you see that he sees a bigger picture for each sort of strategy, or you see somebody that has some sort of, I don't know how to say, some sort of policies that he wants to connect he wants to use them in favor of the United States economically? How is there any sort of bigger picture for Donald Trump? Because if that's China, he tries to talk with China against Russia. That didn't work. Right now, he's trying to play with Russia against China.
It didn't work yet. It didn't work yet.
Yeah. But we know that these two countries, China knows if something happens with Russia. China knew all these 3 years of the conflict in Ukraine, if something happens to Russia, the next would be China. They know how important, what at stake for them. Yes. Russia knows right now Donald Trump is going to be for 4 years in. He's not going to last forever. 4 years as the president of the United States. What would happen after Donald Trump? These are long-term strategies on the part of Russia and China, I mean Iran. The question is how they're going to deal with Donald Trump. Is there any sort of grand strategy on the part of Donald Trump to start with?
Well, perhaps I'm the wrong person to ask that question. When Donald Trump looks at grand strategy, he looks in the mirror. In my view, he is a certifiable megalomaniac. He's not mentally normal. If you look at him, he can represent political views. He can represent constituencies. He can represent. He can mouth. He can say what he's been told to say, and he doesn't read speeches very well. He stumbles. His mental capacities are really limited by his psychoses. I don't know how long it's going to take for the world to wake up that the man is half mad heading towards full mad. It took a long time before the effects of Lewy body dementia, a symptom of Parkinson's disease, was recognized in his predecessor, President Biden. It took a long time for the press to accept that the president of the United States was mad, was incapable, demented. That was Biden. Will it be quicker for the press, for the world to recognize that President Trump is mentally deteriorating? So let's not talk about what Trump says. The Indians very clearly said last week, and I keep mentioning them because they're the first major power already in war with China, a minor border war, but could expand at any moment. The Indians are realistic, and they've been saying, Lieutenant General Ravi Shankar, I quoted in my piece of today, don't focus on Trump. Don't trust what Trump says. Focus on what he does. Focus on what the US does. Focus on what our Indian interest would be in what happens next. So if you don't mind, Nima, I'd rephrase your question, focusing on what the US is planning to do, what the US says it's doing, what we can see they're doing, rather than what Trump says. Then we come to the issues of interest, the US military interest, the US business interest, the US commercial interest. All of those things Trump passes from moment to moment in reflecting in slogan terms. Can each of these, let's say, pursuits of US business interest, US military interest, succeed temporarily against China, against Russia, against Iran, against Korea? That's an eternal question. We're alive still, thank God. So long as we're alive, these forces will fight. They will misrepresent what we're saying today in order to advance their interests. Americans listening have to ask themselves, do they wish to pay the bill domestically for the Trump empire building at China, against China and the rest of the world, minus Russia, if Russia can be persuaded to neutralize itself? That's a question for all Americans to ask now, even if the US Congress won't articulate it.
John, when I look at Donald Trump's first term, I don't see that he was willing to go after any sort of war, but I see him sending a lot of weapons to Ukraine, putting sanctions on Russia. And on the other hand, right now it seems that he wants to be better than what it was during his first term. If he, in your opinion, if he could achieve an agreement, a permanent solution to what's going on in Ukraine, then some sort of JCPOA with just negotiation with nuclear on the nuclear program of Iran, a new JCPOA, I don't know, 2.0 with Iran, and bring this insanity in Gaza to some sort of solution. I'm not gonna ceasefire, let's put it that way. If he does these three things, do you think that you would change your mind toward him, or he's gonna be again the same sort of man that you're trying to picture for us? Because it's so important, John, when we talk about Joe Biden, when we talk about Obama, George W. Bush, all of these presidents. Even with Obama, he won the Nobel Peace Prize.
Well, he lobbied very effectively to get the Nobel Peace Prize.
Peace Prize,
okay.
but
I don't think that's much of an achievement.
Yeah, but after all, he attacked.
Dylan got the Nobel Peace Prize, Nobel
He
Literature
attacked Libya. He killed a lot of people in Libya.
Correct.
We can understand that. At least we don't see that sort of manner on so far. We haven't seen that coming from Donald Trump. I'm not trying to support Donald Trump, not just, I'm talking about those people who voted in Donald Trump, who trying to understand, to change the situation in the United States and in the world. They're so optimistic because Donald Trump at least he tries to talk with Russia, tries to talk with Xi.
Yes.
He before coming to office, he brought this ceasefire to Gaza. These are huge changes, by the way, so far. If he could achieve all of those things, agreement and a permanent solution to the conflict in Ukraine, and
Well, okay.
JCPOA 2.0 with Iran, and some sort of solution for Gaza, do you think that he's gonna change your mind toward him?
I'm sorry, Nima. Let me just take two bits in a courtroom sense of what you've just said and cross-examine. You said if, so you're asking for a probability. What's the probability? And then if the probability comes true, is he the Nobel Prize winner for the Peace Prize winner for the next 5 years? So before we take more seriously the fantasy and focus on the probability, let's go to each of the pieces you mentioned. You said a permanent solution to the end of war in the Ukraine. Permanent on what terms? What are the terms that the US is placing before the Russian side that represents any permanency? The Russian side has set out a permanent mutual security, non-aggression pact for Europe and for NATO, including the Ukraine. There's no sign that the Trump group are addressing those terms. There's sloganeering about NATO, but not rollback of NATO. There's sloganeering about the Europeans having to pay more without withdrawing nuclear weapons from Sudetenland, Greece, nuclear weapons from Britain, from Spain, from Germany. There's no clear indication from Secretary of Defense Hegseth, who contradicted himself on the point that US troops will be withdrawn from Germany. The US occupation of Germany since 1945 will end. At the same time, Hegseth is saying he wants to reinforce forces in Poland. There's no consistency there. There's no readiness to address what you called, and rightly, Nima, the permanent end of the Ukraine war. The permanent end of the Ukraine war is stable security in Ukraine, of what's left of it, and around Ukraine, starting with the border countries, Romania, Hungary, Poland, and then the central power in Europe, Germany, and then the minor powers, France, Italy, and the UK. There's not even a suggestion that the US side or the European side is ready to come to such a permanent solution. Temporary solution, your if will work. Yes, we will get temporary because politicians of this caliber and businessmen of this caliber want to earn votes now, and businessmen want to earn money now. And the arbitrage, the profit margin from an end of war temporary settlement is very great and very alluring for the people US emissary Witkoff represents, and the Russian people and business interests that Mr. Dmitriev represents. So permanent? No, not yet, not even visible. That if is improbable to impossible now. On Iran, you raised, and then we'll come to Gaza next. On Iran, you and I have had an interesting conversation, and I'm glad to say the audience appreciated it, in which Iran believes it and understands it took serious losses, and it has taken a serious loss of influence in Lebanon, in the weakening of Hezbollah. It has lost its influence entirely in Syria, and it has suffered significant but so far unmeasured loss of security in its so-called defense agreement with Russia. The one that was signed by President Pezeshkian a few days ago is the same on security that Russia and Iran signed 20 years ago. There's been no improvement in the words of commitment that Iran falls back on to defend itself from Israeli-American attack. We discussed that before, and the details are in print for people to check if they don't want to believe me. So, can the Trump administration achieve a nuclear cessation, nuclear weapon cessation with President Pezeshkian that would relieve, which would come with sanctions relief for Iran and an improvement in domestic conditions for Iranian people? That would require the Trump administration to take a much stronger negative line against Israeli attack plans. So on your if there, I can't tell you I know or have any confidence in how the balance of power will work between the Jewish lobby, the Israel lobby in Washington, and what I'm terming the Confederates, the non-Jewish members of the Trump administration who sit at the top of the State Department and the CIA and so forth. Let's come to your if about Gaza. If President Trump is to be believed, and he is to be believed, that he wants to make Canada the 51st state, that he will take over Canada, if he's to be believed, because Donald Trump Jr., a major player in the new regime, wants to take over Greenland from Denmark, I don't see any reason, addressing your if, that he's not to be believed in some Trump Netanyahu Israeli combination to clear the rubble from Gaza and clear the people, the Arabs, the Palestinians from Gaza. That has been a US policy since Franklin Delano Roosevelt tried to negotiate in 1945 with Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia, the removal of the Arabs of Palestine so that Palestine could be occupied totally by Jewish people and become the state of Israel. The US has always had that policy, which it's camouflaged in various ways. The two-state solution, the Oslo Accord solution. At the same time, US policy has been to destroy, kill, assassinate, and ruin every secular Arab resistance to that policy. It's a very old policy. Listeners are welcome to read The Jackal's Wedding, the book that I recently published on that history. So if part of your question, Nima, is can the Trump administration be expected to reverse such a fundamental policy commitment to make Palestine empty of all Arabs? Well, personally, I don't think that there will be a reversal on the Trump side of this fundamental US policy. There are US interests at stake, and not simply whether Mr. Witkoff and Donald Trump Jr. will own the hotels and casinos through Israeli cutouts along the Mediterranean shore of what was once Arab Gaza. So I think I'm a bit more convinced that the probability of your if on Gaza is zero.
Thank you, John, for being with us today.
Thank you for
Let-
having me,
I
Nima.
think we have a lot to discuss about Donald Trump and the future of the conflicts. By the way, thank you so much for being part of this podcast and for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Nima. I look
Take
forward to
care.
another time.
See you. Bye bye.